Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 4th, and we're looking back 46 years to November 4th, 1979. On that morning in Tehran, Iran, several thousand students gathered outside the United States Embassy. They called themselves Students Following the Line of the Imam, referring to Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran's new revolutionary leader. Shortly after 10:30 in the morning, they surged over the embassy walls, overwhelmed the Marine Guards, and seized the compound. What the students planned as a brief symbolic protest would become a 444-day nightmare that dominated American news, destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency, and poisoned U.S Iran relations for generations. The hostage crisis became America's first confrontation with modern Islamic revolutionary politics, and we're still living with the consequences. To understand November 4th, we must understand what had happened to Iran in the previous year. For decades, Iran had been ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a modernizing but increasingly authoritarian monarch backed by the United States. The Shah had been installed with CIA help in 1953 after a coup overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister. Americans saw the Shah as a bulwark against Soviet expansion and Islamic fundamentalism. Iranians increasingly saw him as a corrupt dictator imposing Western values while his secret police, SAVAK, tortured political opponents. In 1978, massive protests erupted across Iran. The Shah's authority crumbled. In January 1979, he fled the country. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, an elderly cleric exiled for opposing the Shah's regime, returned from Paris to a rapturous welcome. Within weeks, Iran became an Islamic republic. Khomeini wasn't just anti-Shah, he was profoundly anti-American, viewing the United States as the great Satan that had propped up the Shah's tyranny for 25 years. President Jimmy Carter faced an impossible situation. The Shah wanted to come to America for cancer treatment. Admitting him would enrage Iran's new government. Refusing him seemed cruel and would anger conservatives who viewed abandoning an ally as weakness. In October 1979, Carter made a humanitarian decision with catastrophic political consequences. He admitted the Shah to New York for medical treatment. Iran exploded in fury. Revolutionary students demanded the Shah's return to face trial. When Washington refused, they decided to take matters into their own hands. The seizure. November 4th started as a demonstration. Students had occupied the embassy briefly the previous February, but that incident ended peacefully after a few hours. This time felt different. The crowd was larger, angrier, more organized. They carried posters of Khomeini and chanted "Death to America." Around 10:30 a.m., students began climbing the embassy walls. Marine Guards, under orders not to fire unless lives were directly threatened, fell back. The attackers cut chains on the gates, poured into the compound, and within hours controlled the entire embassy. 66 Americans were trapped inside. Diplomats, Marines, CIA officers, and staff. The students announced they would hold the Americans until the Shah was returned to Iran for trial. They also demanded that the United States apologize for decades of interference in Iranian affairs and return the Shah's wealth. Most importantly, they wanted acknowledgement of America's role in installing and supporting the Shah's dictatorship. Initially, many expected a quick resolution. Embassy seizures happened occasionally in the Third World and were usually resolved through negotiation within days or weeks. But Ayatollah Khomeini, sensing an opportunity to consolidate revolutionary fervor and humiliate America, endorsed the student action. The seizure became official Iranian government policy. The United States had a problem. Negotiating would look like weakness. Launching a military rescue risked the hostages' lives. Economic sanctions might work eventually, but wouldn't help immediately. Carter was trapped in an impossible situation with no good options. The media spectacle, the hostage crisis, became the first international crisis played out on television in real time. ABC News launched a nightly program called The Iran Crisis, America Held Hostage, that eventually became Nightline. Every evening, anchor Frank Reynolds would intone Day 17 of the hostage crisis, then Day 50, then Day 100. The numbers kept climbing. Iranian students paraded blindfolded hostages before cameras, violating every diplomatic norm. They released propaganda photos and videos. They allowed some hostages to make statements, clearly under duress, criticizing American policy. The humiliation was deliberate and constant. Americans tied yellow ribbons around trees, a symbol of waiting for the hostages' return. The crisis dominated the conversation. Carter's approval ratings, which had briefly surged when the crisis began, collapsed as months passed with no resolution. Every day the hostages remained in captivity felt like proof of American weakness. The Iranians released 13 hostages relatively quickly, women and African Americans whom they claimed to liberate from American oppression. But 52 Americans remained captive, their fate uncertain. The failed rescue. By April 1980, Carter decided diplomacy wasn't working. Against the advice of Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, who resigned in protest, Carter authorized Operation Eagle Claw, a daring helicopter rescue mission. The plan was complex. 8 helicopters would fly from an aircraft carrier to a remote desert staging area, then transport a special forces team to Tehran to storm the embassy and extract the hostages. The operation required precision, luck, and secrecy. It failed catastrophically. A sandstorm damaged several helicopters. One crashed into a transport plane during the desert rendezvous, killing 8 American servicemen. The mission was aborted before ever reaching Tehran. The images of burned American helicopters in the Iranian desert became symbols of American impotence. The hostages, who had briefly hoped for rescue, were dispersed to different locations across Iran, making any future rescue attempt nearly impossible. Carter's presidency was effectively over, though the election was still months away. The political consequences. The hostage crisis consumed the 1980 presidential campaign. Ronald Reagan, Carter's Republican challenger, promised to restore American strength and prestige. He never explicitly said how he'd free the hostages, but voters believed Reagan wouldn't tolerate the humiliation Carter had endured. "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" Reagan asked. With hostages still in captivity and the economy struggling, the answer for most Americans was no. Carter spent the final months of his presidency desperately negotiating for the hostages' release. He succeeded, but with bitter irony. On January the 20th, 1981, literally minutes after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, Iran released all 52 remaining Hostages. They had been captive for 444 days. The timing was deliberate. Iran wanted to humiliate Carter one final time, denying him even the satisfaction of welcoming the hostages home as president. Reagan, who had done nothing to secure their freedom, got credit for their release simply by being inaugurated. Carter's presidency never recovered from the hostage crisis. He had accomplished significant achievements: the Camp David Accords, bringing peace between Egypt and Israel, normalizing relations with China, and advancing human rights diplomacy. But voters remembered the hostages, the failed rescue, and the sense that America was weak and humiliated. Carter lost in a landslide. The Iran hostage crisis fundamentally poisoned U.S Iran relations. Before 1979, Iran had been America's closest Middle Eastern ally, besides Israel. After the hostage crisis, Iran became an implacable enemy. The two nations broke diplomatic relations. For more than 40 years, they viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. The crisis established patterns that define Middle East politics today. It demonstrated that anti-American Islamic revolutionary movements could successfully challenge American power. It showed that holding American hostages generated international attention and political leverage. It proved that Middle Eastern groups could humiliate a superpower without triggering massive military retaliation. The hostage crisis also transformed how America thinks about terrorism and hostage-taking. It led to policies about never negotiating with hostage-takers, though in practice this principle is often violated. It led to enhanced embassy security worldwide. It led to the creation of specialized counterterrorism units and the hostage rescue team. For Iran, the hostage crisis became a founding myth of the Islamic Republic. The students who seized the embassy are celebrated as heroes who stood up to American imperialism. Several went on to prominent careers in Iranian government. The former embassy compound is now a museum called the Den of Espionage, displaying documents and equipment supposedly proving American plots against Iran. Lessons for today. What does November 4th, 1979 teach us about American foreign policy and international crises? First, interventions have consequences that last for generations. The 1953 CIA coup that installed the Shah created resentment that exploded 25 years later in revolution and hostage-taking. When the United States overthrows governments or supports unpopular dictators, those actions aren't forgotten. They have shaped how other nations view America for decades. Second, there are limits to American power. Despite being the world's strongest military and largest economy, the United States couldn't rescue 52 people from an embassy in Tehran. Sometimes there are no good options. Sometimes patience and negotiation are the only paths forward, no matter how frustrating. Third, media coverage shapes political outcomes. The relentless nightly reminders of day 100 or day 200 of the crisis made it impossible for Americans to move on psychologically. Carter might have survived politically if the media hadn't kept the crisis front and center every single night. Modern politicians understand this lesson. Control the narrative, or it will control you. Finally, symbolism matters in international relations. The hostage crisis was about more than 52 people. It was about Iran demonstrating to the world that America could be humiliated, that the superpower wasn't invincible. For Americans, it became about national pride and strength. Both sides became trapped by the symbolic importance of the crisis, making practical resolution nearly impossible. So that's November 4th, 1979. the day Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran, beginning a 444-day crisis that would dominate headlines, destroy a presidency, and poison relations between the two nations for generations. A crisis that began with America's decision to support an unpopular dictator for 25 years and to admit him for medical treatment. A crisis that demonstrated both the limits of American power and the dangers of long-term interventionist foreign policy. The hostages eventually came home. Most rebuilt their lives, but the scars, personal, political, and diplomatic, never fully healed. The United States and Iran remain adversaries, communicating through intermediaries, each viewing the other with deep suspicion. And it all traces back to November 4th, 1979, when students climbed embassy walls and changed history. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The lesson of the Iran hostage crisis is that short-term strategic decisions, supporting dictators, launching coups, admitting deposed leaders for humanitarian reasons, can have consequences that last generations. That sometimes there are no good options, only less bad ones. That patience in the face of humiliation can be wisdom rather than weakness. And that the actions of nations, like those of individuals, are remembered long after the moment passes. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Richard Backus, and I'll be back tomorrow with another story from our shared past.